Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, What Gets Measured Gets Done, Measuring the Effectiveness of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I'm Kayla Kovac-Galton, the Curriculum and Programming Manager at the Diversity Movement. Today, we have two of our TDM experts, Dr. Florence Holland and Dr. Oriana Leach, who will be sharing how to measure and report the success of your organization's DEI initiatives. Dr. Holland, head of consulting at the Diversity Movement, is a visionary leader and bridge builder with more than 15 years of strategic planning and hands-on expertise. She has a well-rounded academic background with practical knowledge of and experience in change management and diversification. Dr. Holland has extensive education experience working with secondary and post-secondary students. She works with businesses to lead strategic planning around talent development and DEI. Dr. Leach is a data scientist and consultant at the Diversity Movement. Prior to joining TDM, she led program evaluation efforts at Duke University, as well as developed and directed programs for gifted and talented youth. A former classroom teacher, much of her DEI work has centered on K-12 and higher education. At the Diversity Movement, Oriana uses quantitative and qualitative data to create insights that help drive clients' DEI goals. During this hour, feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time, and we'll try to answer as many of your questions live as we can. If you're referencing this webinar on social media, please use the hashtag TDMWebinar and tag us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Now I'll drop out of sight and let our host take it from here. Dr. Holland, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Kayla. We are excited, absolutely excited to be with you all today. I know that we have prepared and we're just really happy to be here because we know that in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, how are we measuring? How do we know if we're even making progress is at the forefront of everyone's minds. While we know it's the right thing to do, we also know that we must be able to, as DEI practitioners, as leaders in organizations, as managers, make sure that we are able to talk up the business case, yes, but also show how what we're doing really is making an impact. And so that's our plan for today. We're excited to be here. And I know every time I talk around these topics, I never have enough time. So we're just going to jump right in and get to it. As Kayla says, yes, please use the Q&A to post any questions that you have, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. And as well, yes, you will receive a recording of these slides after the webinar. So Oriana, you're up.
Great. So in today's webinar, we will focus on measuring DEI progress, various data collection techniques, and assessing return on investment of DEI. We will leave a few minutes at the end of our session again to answer some of your questions. So with measuring DEI progress, before we actually begin and we dive into the topics, I want to take a quick poll of our attendees to kind of gauge how your organization is currently measuring the success of your DEI programs or initiatives. Do you use demographic data? Do you benchmark or compare yourself to your competitors? Do you look at your internal data for improvements over the year? Do you do a combination of all three? Or are you all not at the point of measuring DEI program success at this point? So you should see the poll pop up on your screen. And if you could take just a couple of seconds to select the best answer for how you're currently doing measurement within your organization, that will help us to kind of see what kind of audience we are speaking to today.
And we're loving the chat. While you're feel free to use the chat again to connect amongst yourselves as well as with us. But yes, feel free to use that.
Okay, let's see where we are here. Thank you all for sharing. Okay, so it looks like the majority of you all are actually not measuring yet. So I think you are in for an informative conversation ahead. I know that most companies are generally at different levels, as we can see here from the poll, within the maturity in terms of measurement of their DEI programs. But hopefully the information we share today will help you advance and move further along within your program.
So at TDM, we really, have this approach that we believe and actually know is really steeped in, we can't really tell clients in our perspective what to do until we know where you are. And so very similar, if you're in any type of DEI role or leadership role, right, we want to do that kind of self-assessment. We learn in, a lot of leadership classes, right? Maybe it's the SWOT analysis, right? Strengths, weaknesses, operations, and threats, or some type of needs assessment. But how we truly define it through the approach that we take at the diversity movement is we want to know, and we would hope our clients would want to know, where do you currently stand? So we take kind of this 4-step approach that one, the basis is around, you have to assess your organization. You have to, one, know where your organization is from a sense of where you are on your journey related to DEI. You have to then as well incorporate a review of your organizational policies and processes. So that means you may be looking at handbooks, job descriptions, ways that discrimination and harassment policies are placed and talked about within the organizations. But you're really trying to review, do our policies and processes match up to our values related to diversity, equity, and inclusion? And then you do want to take some quantitative and qualitative measurements, and we'll go much more in depth on each of these. But that's really where you're going to look at, are you have surveys, do you have demographic data? Are you doing some type of listening sessions possibly? What ways are you getting a pulse on where your organization is related to your stakeholders in the organization or even externally? Once you do that, now we can look at what are our gaps. So what I mean are there's a difference between one dimension of diversity possibly and another? Is there a difference between people that have worked here 10 plus years compared to newly hired employees, or employees that identify as having a disability compared to persons of color? You have to be able to have that conversation. This data, this that you've collected should be able to tell this story really around where you are. And from there, then you should be developing goals, right? You should not be Googling in an ideal world, right? Sample diversity plan and just copying goals from there. That's not customized to you. How are you really going to assess if you're picking goals that you don't even know are relevant to your organization? So you have to do this data approach. And then yes, once you have goals and you've applied the prescription, right? Think of a doctor, when you go to the doctor's office, a lot of the first part is what? Getting information. And based upon what they think are gaps, ways that your symptoms match, then they give you a prescription. And then you what? Constantly measure. You would go back to the doctor and he says, is it getting better now? So very similarly, once you apply that prescription, how do you continuously measure and track what you're going to do? So one of the things I talked about is knowing where you are. And one way you can do that is through this diversity development continuum that the Institute for Diversity and Certification talks about. There are a number of continuums that are out there. The key here is though, you have to know where in your organization are you? Are we doing this diversity work purely from a compliance standpoint? What does that mean? That means at the bottom of your job description, yes, absolutely, you can put down your EEO and equal employment opportunity statement, right? That's what the law says, right? You tell your employees how to access ADA, American Disabilities Act accommodations. Okay, that's very much just compliant. The goal though is your organization trying to move towards advance? And some organizations you may be at advance, but you have to know where you are. So someone's saying my slides are stuck, so let me see. Are they moving? I'm gonna reshare. Thank you, help me out there. We wanna make sure you can see. And so I'm gonna share one more time. All right. So on this continuum, as I was talking about, and thank you again, and you're welcome. Someone says it's back, yay, right? Because I know you want to get all this information. But in this continuum, you really then want to be able to almost, if I were to right now and ask you to put a gold star where your organization is, where would you be? So again, I talked about compliance. That's literally just doing what the law says. More conventional will be at least you've started on the journey of DEI, as we would say. This may be where your human resources kind of mandates maybe some diverse candidates, or you hold at least maybe a once a year mandatory training, maybe in this mode. HR may at least tell people if you have an issue outside of the law, you come to us, right? So it's kind of like we're above compliance, but we're doing some things. Purposeful really means that you've actually decided that we want to do more than just a little bit, right? We may have at this point looked at establishing some kind of diversity advisory council. We may at least have worked on a business case, right? Like, why is diversity, equity, inclusion important for our organization? You may have even begun the work of creating a diversity plan, right? You really are being purposeful in what you're trying to do and having an understanding that if we do this work right, we could be transformative in what we're doing. The competence stage says, we realize we can be transformational, and therefore we are going to seek compliance and competency really through every organization, every element of the organization, right? So every piece of the organization may have goals that are defined. We may at this rate be looking at who's accountable and how do we hold them accountable. It's tied into their performance evaluations, right? We have listening sessions, we have stay interviews, we have exit interviews. We are using employee resource groups. We may have a supplier diversity program, right? We really have taken it from being purposeful into, again, showing we're compliant and competent, right? So you're pre-building, and then advanced means we have really pushed this towards integrating diversity and inclusion into like corporate growth strategies. It has become commonplace. It is a part of our everyday business operations. Every business meeting strategy that we have, diversity, equity, and inclusion is embedded. It's a part of the kind of the fabric, as we say. It is tangible, it is intentional, and we are measuring that from that point. And so again, you want to know where you are on this continuum, and then with the goal of we want to get to, right, ideally advance. Right? I always hear. So when we say, what do you want this to look like in 2, 3, 4 years from the diversity, equity, inclusion perspective? And everyone will say, oh, we want it embedded in what we do and what we say. Well, that means you're trying to get to this advancement on this continuum. So how does measurement relate to that? As we talked about, well, then you have to know where you are. You have to know where you are, and you have to be using it to really push how and what we're going to do to apply, again, that prescription to make sure and then reevaluate that we're there. So there's a saying that a lot of us probably have heard of: what gets measured gets done, right? What gets measured gets done. And so that emphasizes that diversity, equity, inclusion. This is data driven, right? And I know a lot of us probably out there, particularly in the DEI space, have said, yes, we don't want it to no longer just to do it because it's the right thing to do. You're absolutely right. We are past that. If I were implementing a new software program, I would be able to tell my CEO, by implementing this software program, I'm going to save you this. It's going to give us this, right? And I'm talking in terms of numbers. And we as DEI practitioners and leaders especially have to be able to talk in that same knowledge and in those same types of words. And so this is why we're doing this today, and hopefully we'll give you future words that you can use, but also even data points that you should be collecting. So let's go even deeper, because again, I know we want to get through everything, Oriana. So, help them know what are some common mistakes that people are making.
Yes. So there are 4 common mistakes that organizations typically make when they are attempting to measure DEI practices or goals. First, many companies fail to set specific and achievable DEI goals. Understanding what diversity means at your company is a hard task, but taking that one step further by creating diversity goals can almost feel impossible. Without goals, though, your company could be floating around in the nebulous cloud of needs improvement without a real idea of what really needs to change. So creating specific goals for diversity and inclusion can mean a variety of things. It can be a demographic that you're looking to increase or a change in a process, Or these DEI goals can mean a complete overhaul of your values or a change in hiring strategies. But always remember, goals are not quota or affirmative action. Another common mistake organizations make with DEI metrics, they share vanity metrics. And what are vanity metrics, you might ask? Well, vanity metrics are metrics that make your organization look good to others, but they don't necessarily help you understand your own performance in a way that informs future strategies. And that's the most important thing. The wrong metrics can present a misleading view of system health, and optimizing against them can produce distorted outcomes. Vanity metrics are really dangerous because they provide good optics, but they actually lack significance. For example, some companies include non-engineers like administrative assistants in their definitions of their engineering teams, artificially inflating their diversity numbers with groups that are usually more diverse. Internally, this practice can erode trust with employees who see a lack of diversity on their teams and can delay identifying and addressing problems, while externally, it can lend a company artificial weight as an industry leader when they're really not. So, avoiding vanity metrics altogether instead, and setting tactical goals and embracing qualitative feedback are key parts of evaluating your organization's DEI efforts. Don't allow vanity metrics to cloud your vision. Insufficient or misleading data will only tell you half the story, and you must seek out a full accounting in your data collection efforts to understand the full story. And the third common mistake organizations make with their DEI metrics is they fail to hold their leaders accountable. This one is huge because we all know that we need top level buy-in for any strategies that we're trying to implement to, for us to improve. So who owns diversity, equity, and inclusion at your organization? Often the responsibility for the success, or sadly, the primary accountability for the failure of an organization's DEI initiatives actually belongs to the Chief Diversity Officer, the CDO, or the head of HR. In many organizations, however, these individuals who are put in charge of DEI at the company don't actually report to the CEO or president, or rather to the chief of staff, the chief administrative officer, or sometimes even the CFO. So successfully advancing DEI requires direct engagement from the C-suite, direct reporting to the CEO by the CDO, and holding all members of the organization accountable in tangible ways. There's also considerable evidence that shows that organizations with successful DEI programs have two essential components. One, a genuine organic interest of at least 10% of non-managerial staff, and two, a demonstrated commitment of executive staff, most importantly, the head of the organization. Commitment is demonstrated in multiple ways. Holding oneself and one's team members accountable for both the success and failure of the DEI mission goals and vision is actually the most critical. The accountability can be demonstrated by measuring not only demographics, but participation in your DEI initiatives, such as DEI strategic planning, being a member on a DEI council at your organization, being a mentor, participating in educational workshops, and sponsorship of cultural events, whether those are internal or external. And finally, another common mistake that organizations make is not using data to address their problem areas. Only 35% of chief diversity officers are actually tracking diversity data, according to Russell Reynolds. When people make decisions based on a gut feeling or heuristics, it's impossible to accurately determine the root causes of problems. For example, issues like the gender pay gap and a lack of Black or African American people in STEM roles are symptoms of nuanced problems with no quick fix, and they require instead an evidence-based approach. So merely having data is not enough to deliver meaningful changes that create a more diverse and inclusive workplace. You must actually use it to help drive change. Some other common mistakes in terms of data that I've seen organizations make include bombarding people with numbers. So providing lots of statistical data that your employees are unable to understand or connect with, or they feel has no relevance to their work, and that can be quite off-putting. Sometimes organizations share data with employees that come off as a criticism of current mindsets, rather than presenting the data within the context of communicating hope for the future of the organization and improving gaps found across employee sentiments. Another thing, measuring diversity as a blanket number. So comparing your organization with the industry by tracking EEOC and other data is a good way to start, but this doesn't always reveal the root causes of issues that are hampering your organization's success. So a better analysis, for example, would be to look at how the proportion of females changes across leadership levels. So you can zone in on the biggest problems, such as hiring or retention issues. And then also, sometimes they prioritize reports over insights. Compliance reports filled with general quota numbers aren't really useful for decision making. To start, these reports are generally only seen by the person generating them and the agency they're being reported to. So when data can be accessed in a way that facilitates exploration, it can help organizations understand where to focus their talent efforts to achieve broader goals. Other organizations, they forget to look at post-hire data. How new hires from specific groups fare in the long term reveals important insights about recruitment practices. When all pre-hire and post-hire data systems are connected into one analytics platform, an organization can quickly and regularly analyze the performance of diverse employees and keep an eye on promotions they receive across their tenure at the organization. These insights can help businesses identify high quality employees who come from a variety of backgrounds. And I'll also note here that stay interview data to find out why employees are staying at your organization are just as insightful as exit interview data that may provide insight as to why people choose to leave. And then finally, they don't delve into the why of turnover problems. So retaining diverse talent is just as critical as hiring diverse talent. It's important to not just measure turnover in certain groups, but to also uncover the why of the turnover in certain groups. So people from certain backgrounds, they may choose to leave the organization if they don't feel welcome. But it could also just be a matter of job descriptions not actually meeting reality when they come onto the job. So therefore, it's important to not only measure new hire retention and long-term retention of diverse employees, but also dive into the data to understand why these people are leaving.
Let's go into specifically some data collection techniques, okay? So again, when you're looking at metrics, they are to diagnose your risk areas. You're helping to, again, look at opportunities. You're trying to track the progress of some types of initiatives and or calculate the return on investment. So what to measure? Well, you want to look at both quantitative and qualitative data. So quantitative data is the data that can be counted, measured, and expressed with numbers. They're objective, they're conclusive. And qualitative data obviously is more descriptive, can be observed, cannot be quantified. Why are they together important? Oh, absolutely. We were just working with a client the other day, right? They did the qualitative, meaning we had come in, we had done listening sessions, right? And we created these themes, but it leaves you to think, well, how many people said that? Well, that's only a small group that came to the listening sessions. How does everyone feel? And so immediately the next recommendation is like, well, we need to do the survey, right? Because the survey will help us quantify. So between the quantifiable data and those stories, that themes, them being able to talk, we can then paint a clearer picture, absolutely, across what's really happening in the organization. So what data to collect? This is key. So a lot of people go, oh, demographic data. Well, let me tell you, demographic data is doing nothing but assessing your diversity in the organization. It is not assessing equity. It is not assessing inclusion. Literally, diversity is being able to say how many people you have. And so demographic data, yes, absolutely you could do that. So you would have various, and we'll go a little more deeper into some of the demographic data as well you could collect, but you can make the listing, right? Age, race, gender, how long you worked here, are you a veteran? Are you a person that lives with a disability? Again, so a lot of organizations say, oh, I have demographic data. And I say, well, great. You are working on a diversity goal, but you have not addressed equity and inclusion. So how do you address equity? Well, now you need to be looking at salaries and benefits across the organization, across topics, across to Oriana's part. If Oriana and I come in at the same time, what is our rate of movement? Were we able to move at the same rate under each manager? Particularly if Oriana and a male colleague possibly comes in, is that rate moving the same? So salary, benefits, who's getting promoted? which teams, which managers are promoting people of color, which ones may not be, right? As well as performance reviews, right? Looking at, okay, who is being obviously reviewed at what times, what is being written, is it inclusive, is it truly objective, or is it more people are just comparing people across people, right? And so again, this goes to equity within the organization. And then if you want inclusion metrics, you will want to look at, to Ariana's point before, the turnover rates, right? How long are people staying in our organization? That is then where the climate and engagement surveys come into play. And then as well, you could do these employee interviews. And I know we had a question, I know we've mentioned it both now twice, these stay interviews. Yes, X interviews, everybody knows those. That's once you walk out the door. But I was telling someone the other day, well, what good is that? Because I'm pretty much out the door, right? My last organization, I did an exit interview and HR was like, oh my goodness, if we had known, we could have. So a stay interview lets you say, oh, we know. Now can we help and work to fix it? And so those stay interviews, some people like to put them as the performance review. Oh, well, that's what we do in the performance review. That's not always the same, right? Because I actually may need to have a stay interview about my manager, right? And that's not going to happen in the performance review section. So you may want to do them cross teams. You may want to do them across even higher levels. So if I actually report to the VP of marketing, ultimately, my stay interview may actually be with the chief financial officer, so that again, it looks across the organization and I may feel free, and they should be consistently. A lot of times performance reviews are these once a year, and yes, the managers are saying, oh, I talk to them all the time. But what we really find, particularly around the research of diverse individuals, meaning around particularly minority groups or underrepresented groups, they're not getting all the time the same feedback in a consistent manner. And so you want to allow for other entities. And so the stay interviews is part of that. When you want to look at retention again, here you're looking at career progressions. Who is in the succession plan? Someone said the succession plan, what's that got to do with diversity? Well, you should be able to write now. If you know your CEO is retiring in 10 years, 15 years, who's in the pipeline? And if you don't know who's in the pipeline, or you don't have anybody in the pipeline that is of a different dimension of diversity, you might need to be filling those pipelines. And so that succession planning, yes, it can help if I know that I'm being tapped possibly, but as well, it can help you from a recruitment standpoint. Policies and procedures, we talked about that. Everything that is written should be reviewed for inclusive language, for the ability to say if what is being written is actually what's happening when it shows up. And then DEI programmatic data, which again, this one we kind of most of the times do, like we're like, oh, we had a session, we'll do a post survey. But what you really would want to do is do a pre and a post. If we're having someone come in and talk about unconscious bias, you should do a pre-survey. What do they know about unconscious bias right now? And then ask some of the same questions on the post survey after, and then you can show that the investment of you paying for someone to come in, you increase their knowledge around unconscious bias by 82%. See how that sounds? That sounds fancy. Not just, oh, they liked it. Everybody's gonna say they liked it. It was an hour they didn't get to do work. You be able to say why and how they increased and what across measure. So think of all the time, even before, not just after data, but before to after, so that you can show the growth and or maybe not. And so maybe that wasn't a good investment. I'm not saying every time someone comes it is, but it will allow you to make that case. Other data source examples, we talked about some of these. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about surveys and listening sessions, but you should be reading and looking at, what exists in the associations related to you. I used to work in the accounting in industry, so to say. I worked at our membership organization for certified public accountants, right? They were putting out data, right? They were putting out trends reports, right? The engineering societies, these people are putting out data. And so it should help you, particularly to know what exists, what's available, what is happening in those spaces. Of course, continue to read tons of publications, DEI conferences. I when I first really got into return on investment, it was by attending a conference and hearing Mr. Hubbard speak, that I'll talk about a little later. So DEI conference, virtual or live. I of course love the live one, right? We all are missing that, but even virtually, there's some good conferences out there. Again, there are industry consultants. Here are some of the larger, yes, names that put out reports, but obviously TDM, we have several white papers and things as well, and portals that you can get information. Universities, professors are going to start. Some are doing a great job, but I'm actually been talking to quite a few professors about how they can start connecting some of their research to that. So I think you'll see many more universities attempting to put out expertise in this space. Internal communications. This is one that some really aren't looking at, particularly from a virtual environment. When we're thinking about how are virtual people staying connected. When I say people, now that's everybody. I've worked from home for the last 8 years before it was what everyone's doing. But you can pull, who is talking amongst each other? What type of cross-team collaborations are happening via Slack or what your team's instant messaging, right? Your intranet, who is accessing resources. So that way you could see, one, who's being engaged with who, period, but then also across cross-team collaborations. And then calendar invites. Who would have thought? But yes, if you know that if you could rank where decisions are made in the organization, let's say, right? And if you know the budget meeting, quarter 1 budget meeting is a high meeting where decisions are made, the board meeting is high in terms of decisions made, and let's say performance evaluation is a medium. And then if you try to track who goes to those meetings and who's invited to those meetings, you will be able to see who really is in the room by data. Now we know, to Oriana's part, gut feeling, I know what I see, but by data, you will be able to show them, oh yeah, you invite people to meetings, but these meetings, people don't make any decisions. So you have diversity, but it doesn't even matter because they're not even in the meetings where decisions are made. And you can show that gap numerically, then as well, that can help your leadership team kind of say, oh yeah. Right? So even calendar invites of who is talking with whom and at what level decisions are made can be an extremely important tool that you can use outside of data. But most people are using diversity surveys and some do listening sessions. So we're going to spend a little more time going each into those so that you get kind of our perspective on those.
So one of the most popular ways to collect data about the demographics represented in your organization and how your employees feel about working at your organization or how well you're implementing your DEI goals is through surveys, right? So we all want to hear great things about our organization. And of course, we hope that our employees feel that our DEI initiatives are helping to create a more diverse, inclusive, and equitable work environment for them. However, honest, uninfluenced feedback is the most beneficial in ensuring we are gathering data that will be most effective in helping us evaluate and improve our DEI efforts. Hence, when we are creating DEI surveys in particular, we really must use inclusive language that does not unintentionally exclude a diverse group of respondents, and use unbiased language that does not unintentionally persuade respondents to select a specific answer. We never want to make our survey questions required, especially around demographics. When asking demographic questions, you always want to provide that prefer not to answer option. We want to avoid jargon, slang, idioms, or words that might carry different meanings for different groups of people and can thus present a form of bias. In other words, use expressions and terminology that are commonly understood by the population you're serving. So create accessible surveys. That's something else we have to think about, that people with varying hearing, movement, sight, and cognitive abilities can complete. For example, we want to think about color contrast, navigating drop boxes and check boxes and sliders, et cetera, across different types of devices that people may be completing their surveys on. We also want to make sure survey questions are easy to understand. As a rule of thumb, I like to say a 5th grade reading level. We want to keep all questions at that level, maybe even an 8th grade reading level, but it's really based on your particular organization. You only want to also ask questions that you need to know. And that way you can avoid survey fatigue. And always, always, always consider a survey's length in terms of time and not the number of questions that you have. For example, you might have 40 Likert scale and multiple choice questions that take less than 10 minutes to complete, right? While another survey may only have 10 questions, but takes much longer to complete due to several open-ended questions. So on the screen, you'll see examples of non-inclusive and inclusive approaches to DEI survey questions. You want to really think about demographic questions, especially inclusively. So here we have a non-inclusive approach where we say, do you personally identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? And the reason this question is actually problematic is because it doesn't account for individuals who identify as both transgender and straight. It also does not give the option of prefer not to answer, which we always want to do. So the most inclusive approach for our survey respondents would be to ask these across 3 separate questions around gender identity, transgender or non-cisgender identity, and sexual orientation. And of course, always leaving room for that prefer not to answer. Finally, you want to avoid using any leading questions that might persuade or encourage your respondents to answer a certain way, which of course, again, presents a possible bias issue. So here we see as a biased approach, are you excited about the efforts your company is putting into diversity and inclusion? Yes or no? Well, this question uses the adjective excited, right? And so that can actually encourage a respondent to answer a certain way. So the more unbiased approach would be to say, your company is committed to diversity and inclusion, right? You could say true or false, but you could also use a 5-point Likert scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. But you really want to use neutral words that are objective and contain no insinuations at all. And so now we'll talk a little bit about inclusive demographic breakdowns. And I did see a few questions in the Q&A already around this. So we really recommend using detailed, fine-grained breakdowns for metrics and surveys. We recognize that some of these get very narrowly specific, which can actually pose problems for really small organizations. One possibility is to roll the data up into broader categories as appropriate to help with that. And it's certainly advisable to do so to protect individuals if their anonymity would be compromised otherwise. So a common rule of thumb is to require there be at least 5 people in a group before survey data is available for review, for example. And here, demographic data to collect, again, to Florence's point, around racial, ethnic identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, disability status, veteran status, whether they are English is the first language, their age, how long they've been at the organization. And even sometimes you might want to ask about their family status, whether or not they have children in the home. Are they responsible for other people? Are they doing any caretaking work outside of work? And their level of educational attainment. So while you don't necessarily need to go as in depth with your racial ethnic identity categories, there's a good rule of thumb that you want to align your demographic questions centered on race and or ethnicity, specifically with the US Census, since the US government already collects that data. But here's an example of inclusive racial ethnic identity categories that really goes a little more extensive than some of the other surveys that you may have seen. And then pitfalls. So there are some pitfalls that you should avoid when it comes to your DEI survey. Inaccurate demographic data. So analyzing your survey results in the context of demographic data is vital. You must have a way of capturing accurate demographic data before planning your diversity and inclusion survey. Most organizations choose to use the EEOC's 8 protected characteristics, which include race, color, religion, sex, national origin, age, disability, etc. But you can also include other demographic groups. Unclear or insincere communication. So plan how you will communicate the reason for having employees complete your DEI surveys. Anything that comes across as a tick box exercise will put people off. Demonstrate your commitment to listening and acting on employee feedback. Involve leadership. That is important in authentic communication. so that you're announcing your survey and sharing why it's important to your organization. And then a resistance to your results. DEI survey results, they often highlight issue areas within your organization or present an alternative view of your culture. And as a leader, it can be really difficult to hear this feedback from your employees. We can be prone to just justifying or explaining away that feedback though. However, it's really important to approach your survey results with an open attitude and a willingness to accept the results for what they are. And then finally, not bringing people with you. So when you're introducing a DEI survey to your organization, it can be a challenge to get everybody on board. Sometimes DEI initiatives can reinforce the feeling that people are being excluded. Overcome this by ensuring you have authentic communication, again, a visible leadership presence, and management level involvement. And so we'll also talk a little bit about listening sessions. So listening sessions, they're an integral part of the data collection process. They help to ensure that there are not only quantitative measures with your survey, for example, but also qualitative measures that can be analyzed to help tell the whole story of what is really happening at your organization and any gaps that may need to be addressed in order to improve your organization's DEI efforts. So what are listening sessions? Well, I like to sometimes think of listening sessions as focus groups, for example, that you use in marketing and education research. But participants in listening sessions, they're asked to talk about their experiences and specific questions about a topic. The end goal is to really understand the opportunities and challenges surrounding a topic as perceived by your staff at your organization. They typically last between 1 and 1.5 hours and should ideally have a group of 5 to 15 participants to ensure everyone has the opportunity to share. And you always want to use the same questions to ensure validity and reliability. And the role of the listening session facilitator. So facilitators, they should really serve as a guide to participants and provide the logistics, set the tone, encourage participants to provide honest feedback and practice empathetic listening, which is really important. Allow participants to work together and clearly give their input. And also, usually there's a note taker in the room, and the facilitator can also aid the note taker in capturing important information or themes that may arise with the employee's sentiments. Be alert of any group dynamics and encourage challenging reflection. And it's also important that whoever's putting these listening sessions together, whoever's in charge of that they are also mindful of group dynamics. So if you have managers in the same listening session with the people that they supervise, their supervisees may be hesitant to provide their honest, open, their full honest feedback. Encourage open dialogue also. You want to encourage your participants to freely discuss and share as they feel comfortable and provide, again, their honest feedback. Refrain from inserting personal opinions or agenda. Facilitators shouldn't lead participants in their responses in order to maintain objectivity and not influence the authentic sentiments of the group that can skew the data. And finally, you want to maintain respect and safety within the group. I like to encourage my participants when I'm conducting listening sessions to apply the Vegas rule. So what happens in our listening session stays in our listening session. And then finally, we just have some examples of listening session questions that you may choose to ask. So, for diversity, do you feel you can identify with people similar to yourself in leadership positions at your organization? Why or why not? So any question that might yield a yes or no and kind of stop that, that conversation, you always want to say why or why not so that you can, your employees can elaborate on their responses. Do you feel that your unique attributes, traits, characteristics, skills, experience, and background are valued at work, and why or why not? And in terms of equity, can you describe obstacles you've faced in your career progression? Do you believe promotions here are based on merit or performance? Why or why not? And so those who may say, no, I don't. Maybe there is some kind of bias that they feel for certain groups at the organization, and you want to really dig into that. Inclusion and belonging. Do you believe or do you feel that you belong at your employer? Why or why not? Do you feel that you're valued and an essential part of your working group? Why or why not? Because employees may feel that they belong at their employer, but they may have issues within their own work teams, and they may not feel valued, or they may not feel heard, or they may not feel that they belong within their work team. And so that's also important.
And lastly, when we talked about in the session, really in the beginning slide, right, related to, so I take data of myself, but then how do I compare? And so that benchmarking, when we asked even in that poll, are you looking internally? Do you compare yourself internally? Do you compare yourself to other organizations? That's really the process of benchmarking, right? So you can, benchmark against yourself, but then as well, you would want to look at ways you can benchmark across another person in your same industry, some organization of your same size, same, nonprofit to nonprofit, but you have to be able to, one, definitely against yourself, right? That's how you're going to, same survey you gave a year from now, and, should be the same one to see if you've had growth, but then there also should be ways that you can benchmark against what's available, what is in there in terms of the industry. So there are, different groups that can do that. There's, again, going back to where you're reading and doing that at the diversity movement, we can help you do that. So again, your goal would want to be benchmarking and seeing where you stand. Because again, you don't want to, make these broad claims. We're going to increase, our diverse population against race in STEM by, 100%. If you look at an organization your size, where you're located, what's available even in graduation rates, that may not be a realistic goal. So you want to be able to benchmark so that, again, you have some sentiments of where you are in your industry and organizations like yourself. And lastly, really is around, how can you quantify this? So a lot of times when people say, return on investment, we tend to jump to, these overall research kind of papers we read, right? We want to jump to, in Harvard Business Review, it said that if you have diversity, you're going to increase innovation by 19%. Again, that's somewhat return on investment. It's more a business case for why. It's really not going to speak to your leadership about your organization, right? And what money I give you or resources I give you or people's times on these diversity councils. How is it return of investment to me? And so you really want to then start to be able to have this mindset and this dialogue and data perspective that you can show how it is impacting sales or impacting customer satisfaction or impacting we're able to reach more people because we actually are asking clients, was our DEI brand part of the reason why you came to us, right? You can quantify that, meaning we got 6 new clients because they said it was because of our diversity in our organization. You can relate that then to what? Money. It was important for us to spend the money on marketing, let's say, compared to not. You also then want to be able to start quantifying recruitment, right? How much is it costing you per, to source? How much is it costing you per person coming in? So that can then translate why it's important for what? For us to keep them, right? And so you should be able to then, again, quantify every time we lose someone, and particularly as we move up in the organization. If we're not promoting people, people will leave. And that's equivalent to we lost a vice president for blah, 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 blah. And that relates to how much money. So you want to be able to, again, return on investment, start to quantify how this we're losing. And there's a group called Hubbard and Hubbard who, am I frozen? There's a group, Hubbard and Hubbard, that has started doing that work. And you are there. And again, I think someone says I'm freezing. I'm in Alabama, if you haven't noticed, and we had terrible storms last night. So my internet may be doing all kinds of crazy stuff. But you want to be able to, again, calculate that from a standpoint of dollars. And then lastly, there is that group, as I talked about, Hubbard and Herbert, and they have a whole book that's out there in terms of return on investment related to DEI. And they provide this formula, and they go much more in depth than we have time to hear to do this mathematical lesson, but I'm happy to do it with you. That was my undergrad degree, was in math. But we can talk about, again, how you quantify this and how then you are able to talk to your leadership in terms of money. because that, again, you have to be able, and percentages even related to returning on investment, that the money that they're investing in you or this, again, advisory council or training has been worth it. And you're able to say it, yes, quantitative and qualitatively, but even in terms of dollars. I know we're coming up on time and we do want to get to a couple of questions, but the main things that you need to remember in a huge, huge way is you want quantitative and qualitative data. You want these things customized to you. You have to start thinking of this in a traditional and non-traditional way. I know some of the categories like, well, what about if it's in HR? And then what about if it's over here in finance? And what one of the huge responsibilities around DEI is you have to be able to collaborate across all types of departments. One, because your policies have to be, and your events and activities have to be, but I also need information. And so you're going to have to create, with your legal counsel, what is their risk aversion? Can we ask these questions? I know this is what is asked, but here we don't want to ask that so much. So that is something you would work out with your legal. And then at the end of the day, I promise you, you have to communicate. In the diversity and inclusion space, we talk about this being a journey more than I think any probably almost other profession, but yet we don't communicate the journey. We only communicate the end products. We only communicate after something has happened. You should be communicating with individuals all the way through. We've released a survey. That's important because we just saw today over 55% of people aren't measuring any kind of way. That's important to your organization. We held a listening session. That's important. That's showing people that you are valuing their feedback. So publicize that. Again, internally or externally, but you have to be willing to communicate and really do that. So Oriana, you want to do the last 3 must-haves and then we'll try to blaze through some questions.
Okay, that works. So finally, I want to leave you with the 3 must-haves to assess your progress towards your DEI goals. So first, you want to identify gaps in your data. You cannot develop DEI goals or try to assess DEI goals without first gathering data to find out where your organization stands, how your employees are feeling about DEI at your organization, and where gaps lie across the organization and across particular groups within the organization. Second, of course, you want to implement SMART DEI goals. Your goals must be specific and detailed. They must be able to be measured, provided your current resources, time, and manpower. And they must be attainable or realistic. And then they must be relevant. They must make sense given your broader goals as an organization, as well as what emergent data tells you. And finally, they need to be time-based with targeted dates for specific deliverables. And finally, you really want to have to evaluate, revise, implement again, right? Sometimes you need to implement new, and sometimes you need to implement revised initiatives based on your data. So the goal here is to always strive for continuous improvement. So collect those pulse surveys to determine where your organization is hitting or missing the mark following the iteration of your DEI goals. Remember, there's always something that you can be doing better. But the first step really is to collect the data to help you figure out where and how to make those improvements first.
Woo, we made it, Oriana. Like seriously, we tried to, again, we talk about data. One, as you can see, both of us are passionate about this, so we love talking about it, but there's so much to share. So one, of course, we are willing to work with you, and definitely you can reach us through the diversity movement, and we're happy to have conversations with you and your organizations around ways that we can help you with data, as well as through our portal. So portal.thediversitymovement.com. We've been talking about that. We already have tons of information in there, but we can continue this conversation across all of us in our organization and you as diversity practitioners there as well. So please feel free to reach out to us. And I saw some people in here have some great ideas as well. So hopefully you'll find ways that you can connect. Of the last few moments that we do have together, I want to, in general, I know there were quite a few questions around legal, and I kind of mentioned that. Absolutely. As a diversity inclusion expert or practitioner in your organization, if you have legal counsel, you do want to seek them out. We're not by any means lawyers here. However, our go-to reference is why we emphasize that I prefer not to answer. You have to give people an out, period, just like you would on the employment side. Why, though, do we ask it? And why And the purpose, I think, is key. And not think is key, it is key. As you release these surveys, you should have communication around the survey and what it is, how you're going to use it, and how it influences. So I'll give you an example. The last organization I am, when you came in, you fill out your profile, the race category was not a mandatory, right, in our profile. So as we got ready to pull data, our HR was like, we're pulling data. It's not telling the diversity inclusion team anything about it. And they said, well, we're not asking, we don't ask. And so we said, okay, what if we put out a communication to people about why we want you to go back in and fill that portion out of your profile, and what would it do? How are we going to use it? And we did. We tell them the purpose is so we could create the strategic diversity plan, so we could identify gaps. Did everybody go back in and fill it out? No. But did we have like an overwhelming percentage? I think it was something like 80% of the people that had not before go back in and do it. Yes, because it's my work environment. And so if you're going to do something to help me in my work environment, and it was clear what you're going to do with it, then I don't mind answering the question. So do you have people that say, I prefer not to answer? Absolutely. We get that all day long. But when there is clear communication around the purpose of it, we see less percents of people that choose, I prefer not to answer, right? Someone else asked, I think, Oriana, and maybe you can, in a very high minute here, talk about when you are in a small organization, though, when you collect that data, then it can become almost identifying. So what is or are some suggestions you may have related to that?
So in that case, we really want to, a lot of times what we do in the insights when we're collecting that data is to kind of find ways to group people together when we can. So if we see that it is around racial ethnic groups specific to, or LGBTQ groups in general, but you don't have as many of those respondents or employees within your organization, a lot of times we'll just say when we report out, it'll be, okay, well, your LGBTQ, this is how they differ from maybe your heterosexual, straight employees in terms of their sentiments around these particular areas. We've also seen that with, again, racial and ethnic groups. So oftentimes in organizations, you'll see a very different sentiment among your white employees than you would around people of color. And so that is another opportunity for you to kind of group those respondents together when you're reporting out, especially if you're not in a conversation with leaders or there's not that safe space.
Yeah, and I think what you're mentioning there, Ayana, is, it is this ability that obviously you're getting this data, every bit of data, and again, there's transparency to it, but obviously at the CEO, C-suite level, the DEI office level, what you're using and can see in the data may not be what you publicly post, right? You do have elements of the data that you do want to be cautious and maybe, see what you're including or not including based upon the level of expertise of that person and or your comfortability with them, meaning the CEO. He should know everything, but we may not share all of that data because it may not be all relevant to all of the managers. So you may have that. And so with that, that's as well where we say to the leadership team, right, we have small numbers here, and as people have volunteered to put these demographic data, we do want you to be mindful of this. And therefore, our, as a third party, particularly ask of you is not to, continue to speak this as a story that you would be talking out, because obviously then there could be identifiable data across the organization. So you can do that. And same, with that, we can help tell that story in a way that we are grouping, but while yet not making it a vanity metric, as you talked about, Oriana, at the same time. Obviously, go ahead, Oriana. Yeah.
Oh, I just saw a few questions around listening sessions. So really high level again. This was around making recommendations around making them more safe for participants, and how do you avoid situations where non-minority team members may say something harmful, or the minority team member that's attending, to encourage them to have open dialogue. Well, we do this all the time with listening sessions. And oftentimes it can be a group dynamic and who's in the room. Again, that's why you want to make sure that you're paying attention to how you're grouping, whether you're grouping across teams or whatever. But one of the things that we also offer at the diversity movement is an opportunity in those spaces, especially if you don't have, there's only one minority in the room of whatever dimension of diversity they are, who may not feel as comfortable or safe in that space, where we allow an opportunity for anonymous feedback. So creating an anonymous survey where they feel more comfortable sharing their sentiments that way is always a helpful way for you to also still gain the data that you need, even if they don't feel that they feel safe to share in that space. But one of the first things we always say again is practice the art of empathetic listening. What we talk about here and we discuss here, it can't be held against you. It doesn't leave the room. And just really encouraging that space, but also just being mindful of your group dynamic and how you're grouping your listening session participants. It will really help to determine how well your participants, how they feel like sharing, how safe they feel in that space.
Thank you so much, Oriana. Again, we're at time. Obviously, we need like webinar 2.0 or course or something. We see your excitement. And so as a diversity movement, we will be committed to answering these questions either through our portal or some other mechanism. Again, we thank you. At the end of this webinar, when you press leave, you're going to get a 3-question survey. We want to practice what we preach. So please fill out the survey. Let us know, and we welcome your feedback. And lastly, be on the lookout. In 2021, our webinar programming, we have one that will be on April the 8th called Leveling Up Your Workforce Through Disability Inclusion. So we again look forward to the ways we will continue the conversation. Oriana and I are on LinkedIn. Connect with us. Again, connect with the diversity movement through all our social media channels. And it has been our privilege to work with you today. And thank you for the honor for engaging us. Take care, stay safe if you're anywhere where there's storms that are happening, and continue to mask up. We appreciate you and have a great rest of your afternoon. Take care.
Take care.